stanzas on the middle way with commentary by Giles Sapp. Chapter 10. Refuting Misconceptions of the Self. If the so-called self existed by way of its own entity, it should be seen in the state of nirvana. Fearing its discontinuation because it is not seen during nirvana, they say, the conventional is preferable, and so forth. However, the self does not exist by way of its own entity, for if it did, it should be male, female or neuter. But that is inappropriate. The Forders assert two selves, an inner self and an outer self. The first is inside the body, and this inner agent which makes the various sense organs engage with objects is the focus of the conception, I. The second is a combination of the body and sense organs which assists the first.
It follows that the inner self does not exist by way of its own entity. If it did, a woman should in future lives too only ever be a woman, yet change is observed. Femaleness and so forth are also not attributes of the self. Thus it follows that the inner agential person does not exist by way of its own entity, for when the inner self is neither female, male or neuter, it is just out of ignorant confusion that you imagine your own self male. It is a fabrication like mistaking a mottled rope for a snake. Sutra says, assertion, male gender, female gender and so forth are marks of the outer self. Through its connection with this, the inner self is male and so forth.
Answer. It follows that because of their connection with the outer self, the four great external elements would also be a male self and so forth. If that were so, all the elements would be the person, since for truly existent functional things there can be no differences between what is and is not male and so forth. When all the elements do not have male, female or neuter gender, how can the inner self which relies upon the outer self, those elements, feasibly be male, female or neuter? It cannot. If all the elements were male, female or neuter, it would follow that even during the early stages of the fetus, maleness and so forth should be observable. Objection: the same error is entailed for you.
Answer: since we impute gender independence upon elements which lack inherent existence, there is no error. It follows that the personal self is not established by way of its own entity. If it were, just as the thought, blue, arises universally in relation to blue, the thought, I should arise in Yajna when he observes Devdatta's self, but it does not. Since that which is yourself is not my own self, it follows that the object of your conception of I is not a self existing by way of its own entity, because it is not ascertained as the object of my conception of I, or my attachment to the self. Therefore doesn't the thought I arise in relation to impermanent things called form and so forth. The self is only imputed. Assertion: the self is permanent because of being the one that enters and leaves cyclic existence. If there were no self, who would be in cyclic existence because of accumulating actions? Who would gain freedom from cyclic existence? Thus the self exists.
Answer: it follows that it is illogical for the self you assert to be permanent in a separate entity from the body, because the person, like the body, changes from one rebirth as a god, human and so forth to another. Assertion: without a self there would be no physical movements such as stretching or flexing because the body would lack an activator. Thus an inner agential person exists who activates the body just as Devdatta drives his chariot.
Answer: that is illogical. It follows that your life force or self is not the instigator of physical movement because the self is not tangible. It is so because, just as a chariot can only be moved by something tangible and not by anything intangible, an intangible functional thing cannot actually move that which has form from one place to another. Though Vaisesikas assert that the self has form, they do not accept that it has external tangibility and so forth. It follows that if the self is permanent, it is contradictory to teach nonviolence as a practice to protect it from dangers such as a bad rebirth or to wonder what conditions are not unfavorable to it, because nothing can harm a permanent functional thing, just as a diamond which is not in danger of harm is never protected against woodworm, nor does it need to be. Assertion: the self is permanent because there is memory of previous rebirths. Memory of other lives is not feasible for a composite thing whose nature is to disintegrate as soon as it is produced.
Answer: you may consider the self permanent because there is memory of past lives, like thinking, I was human in my last rebirth. Then how could your body be impermanent? It should be permanent because in a past life you saw the scar of a wound inflicted on the body, and now, when you see a birthmark which resembles that previously inflicted wound, you say, that is the scar of the wound inflicted in the past. According to us, the object of the thought, I, is co-extensive with both the self of the past and of this life. Since it is merely imputed, memory of past rebirths is feasible. There is a bowl of curd in a house. The footprint of a pale-colored pigeon perched on the thick thatch is visible on it, even though its foot has not touched the curd, and so forth. Similarly, all actions and agents are feasible for that which arises dependently. It follows that the self cannot remember past rebirths because it is asserted as mindless matter. It is also unreasonable to assert that it remembers past lives by virtue of having mind, because by first lacking memory and later possessing memory, it has given up its entity.
If the self, despite being matter, is a knower of the past because of possessing that which is mind, by that same argument, the attribute, that which is mind, should be mindless in matter because of possessing a self which is classified as matter. It follows that the self is also not permanent because first it does not remember but later newly develops memory of past lives. If the life force or self has mind because of having attributes like intelligence, then because of having attributes like pleasure and pain, it should appear as different as pleasure and so forth while experiencing satisfaction and affliction. Thus, like pleasure and so forth, it cannot be permanent either. Samkhya assertion, if the self is asserted as matter, these inconsistencies apply, but since, according to us, the person's nature is to be